I think one of the major additions to the second edition that is obvious to any reader that picks it up is the addition of the new chapter on ethics.
Yes.
That's something that I would like to just delve into a little deeper with you just now. I'd like you just to perhaps talk a little bit about why you felt it was necessary to include an additional chapter, following on, if you like, from the more pragmatic concerns that concluded the first edition. And then perhaps we could talk about your understanding of ethics as applied to translation.
Okay. As I said, the last 10 years have seen a lot of developments and changes in the way the discipline functions. We now have a discipline, and in the way the profession functions. The fact that we now have a discipline in itself requires us to think and engage with issues of ethics, because there's hardly any discipline today that doesn't have a component of ethics in the training it delivers to its students. So even things like computer science, business studies, medicine, of course, engineering, all disciplines have to deliver some component of ethics, because that is part of the maturation process of a discipline, to show that it's able to reflect critically on what it does. In terms of the profession itself, of course, we have seen increased professionalization in recent years in translation and interpreting, and that means that translators and interpreters are more accountable than they used to be. They are more visible and more accountable. Accountability means that you have to be able to reflect on what you do and take decisions that you can then answer for, whether legally or in other ways. And from teaching a lot of students over the years, I know that when they go out onto the market and work as professional translators, they often come across situations that they have never anticipated. Situations that are not taxing linguistically, but they are taxing in terms of their ethical implications. And because they haven't anticipated them, and they haven't rehearsed arguments and thought critically about the impact of what they do on others, they often make decisions that they regret later. And that's even more important, actually, than legal accountability, because at the end of the day, people live with themselves. They have to live with themselves. And if they end up making the wrong kinds of decisions, and they have no way of going back and putting things right, that's quite an unpleasant thing to live with. And so I felt that it is important to add something that reflects now that increased professionalization in the discipline, and the fact that it is a discipline, something that shows that we can reflect not only on the kind of mechanics of what we do, but can that allows us to reflect on the impact of what we do on others, because that's what ethics is. And you asked me about my understanding of ethics. Ethics is about the impact of what we do on others, and this kind of difficult balance that we have to keep between the rights of the self, my rights personally, and the rights of others that I come in contact with, and the rights of different others, because often the rights of different people clash with each other. This is what ethics is about, and it's a very difficult area to reflect on responsibly, and be able to. It is something that we have to negotiate all the time in our daily lives. But translators and interpreters are in a very important position of having a major impact on the lives of others, the welfare of others. They work in situations like the asylum system. They work in courts. They work for minority groups. Just about everything that they do has an impact on the lives of others, on the quality of life, on their survival, and therefore they have to really think very, very carefully about the implications of what they do for others.
I think this ties in very nicely with the whole approach of the book, really, where you're moving very much from what was previously a sort of prescriptivist standpoint towards description, and towards thinking about numerous options for dealing with particular situations. Whereas in the more textual-based parts of the book, it's about strategies, translation strategies. When we go into the chapter on ethics, we're talking much more about options of behaviour, roles that interpreters and translators take. Do you think that that's an area that has been neglected in translation studies teaching? I think, for example, very much about the way in which ethics has been approached in terms of a sort of rule-based system, in the way that, you know, if this happens, do this. And
Yes.
Is that something you're trying to counteract?
Indeed. I mean, my approach in this chapter is completely different, and I actually start by saying that translators and interpreters cannot assume that they can simply fall back on codes of ethics, codes of practice that are provided by the different associations, but they have to learn to think critically for themselves and decide for themselves, obviously within kind of a broader awareness of the entire discipline, entire profession, but they have to think for themselves what is ethical, what is the right way to behave. You cannot prescribe these things because every situation is unique and every person you encounter and deal with is unique. So there's no way you can prescribe behavior in issues of ethics. You can draw kind of broad outlines of what is the right thing to do in general, but you can't prescribe behavior in specific situations. And therefore what I've tried to do in this chapter is it's the same kind of approach that I adopt in the rest of the book, which is it's not a prescriptive approach. It's about giving students a set of conceptual tools with which to reflect on a particular area of practice or a particular area of behavior. So I've tried to do the same here, and like the rest of the book, again, the arguments are based on concrete and authentic examples. These are not situations that I make up. These are situations that are actually documented by professional translators and interpreters. And so I use these authentic examples to allow students to think through the arguments, particularly when you have controversial positions. It's very important to be able to think through the arguments for and against a particular position, even if you know in yourself what it is that you prefer or what you think is the right thing. It's always important to see the other side and to rehearse the arguments for the other side. And so I've tried to build that also in the exercises at the end. So some of the exercises at the end of that chapter are about taking controversial, sometimes high-profile situations and rehearsing the ethical, not the textual arguments, but the ethical arguments for and against particular types of decision.
Which, of course, are evidenced in textual behaviour. So the fact that a translator makes a certain decision textually will impact upon the ethical behaviour, or it mirrors, if you like, or embodies that ethical behaviour.
Some of the decisions are made at a very macro level. So, for instance, there's the decision to accept or not accept an assignment. That you know, before you even get into the textual issue. But a lot of the decisions are made at the level of the text itself, textual choices and their implications for others. Yes.
Thank you. I think one of the other changes that I'd like to talk about, or the, if you like, modifications in terms of updating, is the addition of further references that you've included in the book. I think as a lecturer who's been teaching based on this book for a number of years, that's something that's very welcome. I found that what I was doing was adding sort of references towards adding newer references perhaps to the kinds of topics that you were selecting. I think, just to kind of come back to the perspective of the lecturer using this book, the feedback that I've had very much from students is that it's very user-friendly, very clearly and coherently argued, and that they find it quite easy to apply, despite there being quite complicated linguistic concepts being explored within the text. How do you feel about its suitability for students with no background in linguistics whatsoever? Is this something that you deliberately set out to do?
Indeed, that's why I argue for a top-bottom approach in the book, starting with very, very low-level, very small units of language, and very carefully and in a detailed way working through the different levels until you come to quite complex things like theme rime organization. For instance, that's one of the most difficult chapters and longest chapters of the book. Now, some students, not everybody's got aptitude for linguistic analysis, and some students will skip a chapter like the theme dream analysis, although I hope that I've made it as user-friendly as possible. But the book on the whole is designed for students who don't have a background in linguistics, but also I hope allows students who have an aptitude for this kind of thing to take it further, to develop it further.
I mean, I think this is also or students with less of a background in linguistics are also helped by the comprehensive glossary at the end, for example, and explanation and definition of key terms throughout. I think that that's something that you do, even more basic linguistic terms that they may not be acquainted with.
Yeah, and the concrete examples, of course, because it's the concrete examples that bring a theoretical notion to life.
I mean, obviously you deal with English in the book, and your examples are of translation from English into other languages. And when other languages are used, you provide English back translations of those examples. Do you see that as limiting the book's applicability, the strategies that you talk about, for example? Are they particularly related to English and translation from that language?
No, I don't think so. I think a lot of the strategies will apply to a lot of language combinations. And I think that the use of a wide range of languages is enriching for all students, irrespective of their own language combination, because translators need to be sensitive and aware to the way language works in general, and being able to see this with languages that they don't even speak and be able to follow what is going on in the language can only enrich their awareness of how language works and their sensitivity towards things that they may not even be aware of in their own language, but when they see it analyzed in relation to another language, they may become more sensitive to it in their own language.
I mean, that's something that native speakers of English, my students, have said to me, that it's actually taught them about their own language and how it works, and to recognise particular elements of that language. So that's been continued then, I presume, in the second edition. Many thanks, Mona. I think we've managed to cover everything we wanted to cover today. We've talked about the additions to the new edition of In Other Words. We've looked at the new chapter in a little bit more detail on ethics, and we've looked at the kinds of different texts that we've dealt with in translation and are continuing to deal with in translation in 2011. So thank you very much. We're all looking forward, I think, to now reading and using the new edition in our translation teaching. Thank you very much, Mona.
Thank you. Thank you.